For decades, America has tried to combat the harms of drug use primarily through banning drugs and incarcerating people who use them. But this has caused a violent underground market for drugs, increasing crime in our communities. It's caused contaminated substances, increasing overdose deaths, and it's caused incarceration to skyrocket, destabilizing families. What we're doing isn't working. Crime, death, and broken families are the collateral damage of using the criminal justice system to address the public health issue of drugs. If you're looking for a better path forward, you're in the right place. What if we changed our drug policies to prioritize life, health, harm reduction, and thriving? And what if it benefited all of us? Our criminal justice approach to drugs had a beginning, and it can have an end. Join us on the journey to end it for good. I'm Christina Dent, your host, and if you're new here, End It for Good is a nonprofit started in 2019, based in Mississippi, that invites people to support approaches to drugs that prioritize life and the opportunity to thrive. This podcast is one of the ways we do that. You can head over to episode 34 to hear my story as a conservative Christian foster mom, changing my own mind on the best path forward with drugs, and then come on back and dive in deeper. I didn't change my mind overnight, and most other people don't either. We all need time to learn, think, ask questions, and explore. Whatever your perspective is, I'm glad you're here. Let's journey together. Welcome back to the End It for Good podcast. I'm Christina Dent, your host. Really excited to be here today with Stacey McKenna. She's a medical anthropologist and senior fellow in integrated harm reduction at the R Street Institute. She's conducted research on substance use and addiction in the United States as well as Malawi. So that's pretty cool. And in her work with R Street, she studies and writes about how policy affects people's abilities to protect their health. So we're going to specifically kind of focus in on women and pregnancy and substance use and all those things today. But first, Stacey, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here today. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Fantastic. And I love that, the people that work in these things, they're just people, Stacey and I were talking about our dogs prior, and you might hear her dog in the background at some point while we are recording. That is okay, because this is real life with real people doing things that they care about. And so we're going to dive in. One of the things that I'm really interested to talk to you about is your experience as a researcher and medical anthropologist. You had this really unique experience of being able to go live with people who were and kind of do daily life with people who were in active substance use. And so take us back to, I want to talk about that, but take us back to how you got into this work. Why do you care about this work? You're very passionate about it. And so take us back to how you kind of got into this space.
Yeah, for sure. So I started using methamphetamine in my mid-teens back in the 90s. And when we had a really different drug supply than what we have now, it was probably a time when experimenting was a lot safer than it is today. But I started using meth for a variety of reasons, everything from being a kind of overachiever with a minimal social battery to having an eating disorder, and a lot of stuff just kind of came together, and meth worked really well for my life. I felt like it did anyway. And so I used fairly heavily on and off for years. And it certainly, there were times when it created challenges. My use was chaotic, not always in my control. I probably did some things that I look back on and I'm not thrilled about. I also was just a normal young person experimenting with life and trying to figure things out. So fast forward, I stopped using in my early 20s. Fast forward about 5-6 years from that, and I started grad school in Colorado. And I was trying to figure out what on earth I was going to do for my dissertation. And I was really interested in the relationship between sort of capitalist-driven productivity and speed and other stimulants. And so I was trying to figure out what to do. I thought about working internationally. And then I was driving down I-25 in Colorado from northern Colorado to Denver and on my way to class. And I saw a billboard from it was the Montana Meth Project had sponsored these billboards it was the meth, not even once. And it was these faces of people who looked like zombies. And then I started seeing ads and videos that would pop up, and the people just looked like zombies, and they were in these like they were losing their virginity in the most disgusting bathrooms you've ever seen. And I mean, just these horrible trajectories. And I was like, huh, that is not at all what my reality of methamphetamine use looked like, right? That's not what most methamphetamine use looks like, because most people who use drugs move out of it, they age out of it like I did. Something happens in their life that helps put them on the track. Maybe they have a kid and that sort of pushes them to make a life change. Maybe they get a new job. So I was like, man, I'm going to do my research here in the US. I want to do it in a place where the people who are going to bear their lives and their stories to me, where I can then turn around and use that information to do something that makes their worlds a little bit better.
So you saw this marketing campaign, for the lack of a better term. It was sort of an anti-meth campaign that just seemed so not in line with what you had experienced in your own life as somebody who had used meth for many years. So what did you decide to do as part of that research for your dissertation?
Yeah, so I was in a multidisciplinary program, which was great because it meant that I was in this position to I wasn't locked into any approach, and I really got to do what made sense. So I did a combination of stuff. I did some deep dive media analysis where I just looked at the way we portray stimulants in popular culture. And both legal and illegal stimulants. So Adderall was just starting to come on the scene as a super popular college drug. And then I also spent some time, this is when I started doing my qualitative work with people who were actively using meth. And so lots of qualitative multi-hour interviews, and hanging out with folks in their homes. And that dissertation research transferred into trying to understand more about not just the specific experiences, but things like how people were getting drugs, what were they doing with it. Also looking at were the campaigns stigmatizing people? How did that affect people's lives and realities? And so a few years in, it was at the beginning, it was a lot of media analysis and interviews in people's homes. And then a couple years in, it was more what we think of as old school ethnography, where I was just kind of hanging out with folks while they were copying drugs, while they were selling, because I was focused on how they were accessing their drugs and how that related to their social networks of existence. But what it gave me the chance for is I had participants who were with me from the very beginning of my dissertation through many years later. So there's women that I knew for 5 years or something like that, and I was in their life. They were in my life for years. And so that meant not just hearing their stories about their histories, right, or what they thought was going on, but it meant watching their life trajectory change over time as their circumstances changed and as their relationship to their substance use changed.
And what was the biggest takeaway for you? What were some of the things that you observed that were surprising from that?
I think one of the biggest things was that you just can't study drug use without studying policy around it. There's part of why my reality looked really different from my participants' realities, right? A lot of them were on the brink of homelessness or homeless and then temporarily housed, homeless, temporary, right? Like moving back and forth. Um, and a big part of that is because they had criminal records at some point, often for possession. And so I think any conversation about any of that immediately, you just realize really quickly the extent to which privilege and like my position as a middle class white girl, but then also the fact that like I got lucky. I never got a criminal record, right? So I was able to move through school just fine, find jobs just fine, find housing just fine. And like when you have a meth related conviction, it can be particularly tricky because there's assumptions about like it can really affect your ability to get housing. So yeah, I think that was a huge piece of it that stood out for me. I think another thing that really stood out for me was the extent to which people's substance use is so deeply embedded in their like emotional and material survival. So like my one participant who I like knew from the very beginning, when I first met her, she had just gotten housed for the first time in years. She was so excited about it. Like she was just over the moon. She had an apartment. And she was really stable. She wasn't really using meth actually at the time. She was like not super sure she could be in the study even. She was using minimally, if at all. And within like 3 months, she'd been kicked out of her apartment because she'd been letting friends stay. And she had let them overstay what she was allowed, as someone on subsidized housing. And, but to her, she'd been homeless for so long that just how would you not, right? And as soon as she was back on the streets, her meth use just exploded. It just took off again. Partly because the folks who would let her stay with them were other people who were using. Partly because sometimes helping make connections and deal a little bit meant that she could afford to eat that week or whatever it was. It was just, everything was so deeply connected.
Her use was not in a vacuum. It wasn't like,
Yeah.
what do I want to do with the next hour of my life? Just go, get some meth. And I think that's such an important part of what we have lost in the way that our culture has talked about substance use, is that it's just this kind of singular focus. People are just focused on using a drug. They just want to use a drug, instead of focusing on why are they using that drug, and why do they use more at some times than they do at others, and what are the motivating factors in that? What are the things that help them moderate it or not use, versus when does it, that uptick in it, which I think anybody can understand. If you go from having a safe place to sleep every night to maybe you don't every night, and all of the other factors that come into that, how much abuse happens on the streets, particularly for women who live without a safe place to sleep. Wow, that's a significant motivator to not just change the way you feel, but I know I've heard people talk about methamphetamine use, which for those like me who've never used it and have less knowledge about it, it can help you stay up for days at a time. And so if you're worried that you're going to be assaulted and you don't have a safe place to sleep, it can help you stay awake to protect yourself from assault. So for someone like me who has never had that experience of feeling that kind of vulnerability and fear, wow, how could I say that I wouldn't do the same thing if I was in the same situation, in order to protect myself? And I think those are all things that we lose in the general talk about, people just want to use drugs because they're, they just don't care. Or for some people, it is actually the choice is because they do care. And talk about that a little bit, because I know in our offline conversations, you've talked about some of the mothers who were using that you did life with for a period of time, and the things that motivated that. Talk about that, because I think mothers using meth, like you say that out loud in public, and it's like, what on earth? They really must not care about themselves or their children. So what did you observe?
Yeah. So one actually sort of fascinating historical tidbit around that is I have an old ad, and I don't have it in this office, but it's like from the 50s, and it's like Mother's Little Helper or something, and it's for injectable meth from like back in the day, when it was sort of seen as how you keep a housewife thin and happy and meeting all of her obligations. So like, we actually have this like funny cultural relationship to giving women stimulants in order to be better moms. And I say better like a bit facetiously, right? But I think for my participants, like, because throughout a lot of my focus was women, even the ones who didn't currently have custody, motherhood came up. I didn't have to ask about motherhood ever. It was core to their journey in terms of trying to figure out, who am I and what is my drug use doing to my life? Because most of these women, a lot of them had started using meth because they were trying to balance being a single mom and have a job. Oftentimes a job that was something like driving a truck or working really long, weird hours, right? And they were like, how can I do this? I can do this by staying awake longer, and then I can go home and I can still be a good parent to my children. Like, I can still be awake and present and help with homework or whatever it is, right? On the other side, I had, once women were more like deep into addiction and struggling with their own use, not feeling like it was something they were controlling, right? There were, everyone I talked to in that situation who had a kid, their kid factored in ways that I think we often don't give parents who use drugs credit for. They were constantly thinking about, who can watch my kid if I want to use? Does that make me a bad mom if I want to find someone so that I can take a break and go use this way and just like have a minute? But if I keep my kid and I continue using, then does that make me a bad mom? Should I give my kid up? Because would they be better off without me? And I mean, I'm not a therapist, right? My job was really to listen and just try to hear where these women were coming from. And I think what was super fundamental at the core of all of it was this internalized stigma around like how impossible it is to be a perfect mom. And if I talk to my friends who are moms now who don't use illegal substances, they ask themselves the same questions. Am I a good enough mom, right? They aren't thinking, would I be a better mom if I gave up my kid? Because they don't have that extra baggage. But it's still the same core, like, can I be a good enough mom? Am I good enough at this? And like, not one of the moms that I interviewed didn't worry about that, didn't think about how to do it better.
And for people who listening, who their their immediate thought is, well, how you do it better is just don't use substances. What would you say?
Oh man, it's never that straightforward. I think for a lot of them, that was what they tried to do, or a lot of them. And if you look at the literature on, I use the term sometimes aging out. It's like there's a pretty good body of literature around it in the research world that shows that when people have, so most people who use drugs do what's called aging out, like 75% or something. They stop without treatment. And usually what it looks like, and this is even if they've been experiencing like an addiction, what we would think of as addiction or substance use disorder. But what happens is like some big life events come into play. You change your location, you get a stable job, you graduate university, you have a kid, you get married. All these kinds of life things, especially for people who are financially stable. For a lot of them, they move along a trajectory out of drug use. And for some parents, that is what happens. Like they have a kid and that is like the motivating factor to stop using. Something else changes that allows them to stop and make it easier. But I would say it's really challenging to just quit. With my participants, most of them wanted to quit. But things like access to housing made it really hard. They would try, but they would find themselves on the street without housing. And the easiest way to find a place to be inside when it was 0 degrees at night in Colorado was to find someone they had used meth with. And maybe for a few days that worked. And they could do it and they could be around it and they were fine. But after a month or two, that started to be not such an easy choice. Getting into treatment with stimulant use disorders, there's not as much evidence-based treatment as we have for opioid use disorders. We have great medications for opioid use disorder. Stimulant use disorder, we're still kind of figuring it out. It sounds like there's some promising options, but not as many. For folks who have a dual diagnosis, so if they have mental health issues as well as a substance use disorder, getting into those dual diagnosis programs, they're rare. Like a lot of places won't treat both. And so you almost have to pick and choose which you're going to deal with, which can be really hard. And a lot of treatment won't or can't accommodate families or people with children. So if you have a kid and you want to get into residential treatment, say, you might not be able to bring your kid. And so now you've got to separate from the lifeline that is what you want to stop using for and what you want to bend over and give your everything for, right? Yeah, it's always an incredibly complicated choice to make that I think about how hard it is even for if we want to make in our daily lives, we want to make a simple little choice that seems simple, right? About like, I'm not going to put sugar in my coffee anymore, right? I'm going to try and cut back.
Say it ain't so, Stacey. I'm still working on that.
Right? And even those decisions become really hard. And you think about like the social, all of a sudden you've lost your whole social network and you're completely alone. Like if most of the people you interacted with were people you used drugs with, and now not only do you lose some of those material resources, right? Pulling money to stay in a hotel room, whatever it is, but you also lose the people who ask you how you are every day, like the people who care about who you are. And that, like, loneliness sucks. It's really hard to deal with.
Yeah, I've heard people say the worst loneliness is in early recovery or early cessation of use or trying to change something. It's not when you're in active addiction that you might be in a lot of emotional pain in that, but usually you have a lot of people around you who are in kind of similar situations, perhaps.
Yeah.
But when you try to leave that, and then you think about what if you have a child? I was thinking as you were talking about, where is my child going to go while I'm in treatment? It is so common. I was just having conversations 2 weeks ago with a whole bunch of women who were talking, some of them about how their parents helped them with their children, and some who were like, yeah, my parents haven't invited my kids over to spend the night in like 5 years. So if we have accessed, resourced, middle and upper middle class women, all of these women were, and their parents who are, and like the thought of saying, I'm not, my parents haven't even had my kids for a weekend, ever maybe, and I'm going to go and ask them to keep my kids for 3 months while I'm at and do all the school stuff and the homework and our expectations of people are often completely detached from the reality of people's lives. And that's even for people who have lots of resources and have lots of, they might have, maybe their parents even have, one of them stays home. Maybe their mom is a stay-at-home grandma or something like that. But if you have lower income and lower resource families, if we would struggle to come up with someone for 3 months to take care of our own kids, particularly in a situation where maybe those relationships are already strained because of a substance use disorder. So this isn't the best case scenario. This is a really generally difficult scenario to begin with. And then you've got all of this upheaval. And what if they don't live close to you? What if they live in another state? What if they're willing, but are you going to take your kids out of school for 3 months, put them in a different school for 3 months? These are the very real challenges of people who are real people. They're not just a random person whose face you see as you drive down the street, holding a sign on a street corner. There's a whole cascade of things that make up their life and their relationships and their resources or lack thereof, and what's even feasible in their world for them to be able to access. And so that's always so helpful, to that humanizing piece of why is someone doing what they're doing. Maybe we should be asking, what would it take for them to do something different? And do they even have access to that? And how can we begin to create more opportunities to come alongside people who want to make a change, and be able to support that? That's a really, really hard thing to do. I don't know most of us who are like, well, that's fine. They could leave their kids at my house for 3 months. It starts to get pretty challenging pretty quickly.
It does.
On kind of what we want to happen versus what we as a culture are willing to help happen, is pretty challenging. So let's talk specifically. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and I think this is at the core of so much of the work we've been starting to do at R Street around prenatal and perinatal substance use, and specifically medications for opioid use disorder, where right now we're in this environment that focuses on sort of, in most places, penalizing women for taking medications and having a substance use disorder, and focuses on removing the child. But what we'd really love to see is an environment that better supports the mom in making, and dad, to be honest, because right now there's almost no supports for dad, really. But that better supports families in finding stability in a way that is also safe and helps facilitate or ensure the welfare of the child, but that does it for the whole family, and that focuses on how do we support this family in staying together and moving together in a way that is healthy. And
So let's talk about that. So let's think about kind of pregnant women who are struggling with a substance use disorder of some sort. there's not many more highly stigmatized groups than that. It's very difficult for people who haven't had a substance use disorder to understand how on earth could you continue using when you're pregnant and another person's welfare is deeply connected to what you do. You're also exposing them to. What do we know from the research that is actually most helpful to help women be healthy during their pregnancies, which means their baby has a better chance of being healthy? What is kind of the research side of that? And then I'm going to talk about kind of how we can support that on the culture side. But what is the research side of you're right, there is a big push right now to hey, we need to toughen up on women. This is how we protect babies, is for, we got to kind of punish women out of this drug use so that they will stop using while they're pregnant. What does the research say actually does help more women and babies be healthier during this pregnancy period?
It's such a good question. So the research definitely says that threatening to punish women, either with criminal charges or taking their baby away, both of those things, if you look at when policies are enacted and implemented that do that, across the board, you have worse outcomes for the mom, but also for the babies. You have lower birth weights, you have more preterm birth, you have more stillbirth, you have more overdose. We know that penalizing women for drug use during pregnancy is actively harming the baby, the pregnancy, and the mom.
And why is that? It's like people would say, no, that doesn't make any sense. Like they're gonna know that we're serious. They're gonna know they better not be using, so they won't use.
So what it seems like is because it just scares the bejesus out of people. They don't want to connect with anyone then. So they're gonna stay away from prenatal care. They're gonna stay away from recovery. If you've got a state that is going to penalize a woman for taking medications for opioid use disorder during her pregnancy, that's going to threaten to take her kid away for doing that, she might forego the medications altogether because she feels like she's got to choose between taking these medications, which are evidence-based for her, which are evidence-based as safe for the fetus, and which have been shown to improve outcomes after birth as well, right? So we have better birth outcomes when mom's on these meds. And then after the baby's born, she's more likely to do things like go to wellness visits, those early pediatric visits, all this stuff. They're more likely to stay together. She's more likely to stay in recovery. Those medications are huge. But if your state penalizes her for taking them, even threatens to penalize her for taking them, she doesn't want to go to her prenatal visits. She doesn't want to stay connected to recovery spaces. And we know that disconnection from the healthcare system, from even just like social resources, right, is actively harmful and contributing more to that isolation. And then you can't catch the challenging moments until they're really a tragedy has happened, right? But if we position it in a and this is where I think there are great clinicians that we've talked to in Virginia, in San Francisco, really coast to coast all over the country, who are trying to figure out the best ways to support women. And I think what I'm hearing from them over and over again is that what we really need are systems that provide support continuing after birth, right? So we want to make sure we don't penalize women during pregnancy for taking substances, but especially for taking substances that have been prescribed or recommended by their physician or other healthcare provider. But to encourage them to engage with the healthcare system. But then after the baby's born, we also can't just drop them and say, it's not it's not either a threat of taking your baby away or we just tell you to go away, right? That's a really, that those early stages, right? That first year after birth, it's a hard time. Like being a new mom, being a new parent is hard. And it can be isolating, right? These are things that could trigger a return to use. So how do we make sure that we've built systems that provide the kind of support she needs? Whether that's making sure that we have residential treatment available for moms with their babies, or making sure that maybe it doesn't have to be residential, right? Maybe it's step down programs from residential where there's childcare on site and she can come, and then you're kind of doing double duty there where not only does she have access to treatment now, but she also has access to other new moms who are going through the same thing and helping kind of overcome that isolation and some of those other challenges that come with this new life phase. So I think from a policy perspective, the biggest thing is not focusing on this sort of punishment first approach. It doesn't mean there's never a situation where separation makes sense. Of course, there are these situations where temporary or heartbreakingly, rarely, permanent separation could be the best choice. But those are rare. Most of the time, we know that keeping those families together with support is the best for everyone, including that kid.
Yeah. And leads to the best outcomes. And I think that's the what is lost in our political moment of kind of like, we just kind of take what feels right to us. And we say that must be what's right. Instead of saying, but does it actually help, or does it actually harm? Not just what I want it to do or what I think it should do, but what does it actually do? And thinking about those kind of, post-birth outcomes also. If a woman is already feeling safe and cared for and has built trust with the medical team, she's much more likely to stick with that, rather than if she's been basically hiding her whole pregnancy. Let's say she makes it through the hospital and the birth without, a negative event, but like, why suddenly would that change where she's coming back and trusting when she's been afraid for the previous 9 months and been trying to avoid that. And again, not because I think, I'm always putting my devil's advocate hat on, not because it's that she just doesn't care, but because she's afraid that if she comes forward, that's immediately going to put her on track for either being arrested or for her baby being, automatically removed, even if she's working on a recovery plan or, whatever the case may be. Because that's a very real thing that happens all the time. And that is really challenging. Then you've got extra challenges of trying to figure out how to accomplish all of the things that are needed to get your baby back. And that can be really challenging as somebody who has deep knowledge of the foster care system. That is not simple. There is all sorts of things, as I've heard about plans that parents have to complete to regain custody of their children. It's like, my gosh, that is an awful lot. That would be a lot for me as somebody who has just given birth. Your body is in all sorts of reorienting to the world. It's being separated from this bit. Like, it just is, there is so much going on there. And we want to keep babies safe. And I think that's a big part of what I hope people hear from this, is that you're not saying, and the research isn't saying, we're only looking at what helps a mom's health outcome, and it's unfortunate that this actually doesn't help the baby. It's, as we help mothers have better health outcomes, babies have better health outcomes also. Like, you can't disconnect those two from each other. They are deeply interconnected. What happens with that mom and what happens with that baby. And here in Mississippi, where I live, we have one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the country, and it's been in the news. They have been talking about it in the legislature. How do we address this? So I was looking at some of the research on what are the contributing factors to maternal mortality in Mississippi? And I think substance use is about 25%. It's about 1 in 4. There's substance use is a component in that maternal mortality in the first year of their baby's life, either during pregnancy or during the first year of their baby's life. And so that's a really big deal. 1 in 4, this is a substance involved passing away. That's, wow. That is just, gosh, so tragic. So let's talk about, I want to talk just for a second about the medications during pregnancy, because I think there's already a huge stigma for taking medications for substance use disorder, period. Then the thought of like people thinking, wait, what? I already don't think anybody should be taking these medications. Now you're saying that pregnant women should be taking these medications? That sounds crazy. Tell us about that. Why does it help? Why would a doctor prescribe medications? Because it is true that in some states, women are still being penalized for taking a doctor-prescribed medication during their pregnancy. That is a real thing. Children are being removed from their parents' custody because their mother followed the doctor's orders to take this medication that's going to help her be healthier. So talk about the medication piece. I think that is just challenging for people in general, but probably especially to hear about that for pregnant women.
Yeah, this is the medication piece and it is, you're absolutely right. We hear all the time, you're just replacing one drug with another, kind of fear around it, right? But about, as you said, 23 states still explicitly in their laws either fully criminalize or at least require mandatory reporting of people just for taking a medication that was prescribed. So medications for opioid use disorder, there are 3 that are FDA approved. We've got 2 that are kind of considered gold standard, and that's buprenorphine and methadone. And which one is best for a lot of people, like with fentanyl, for a lot of folks, methadone is preferred. But buprenorphine can be a fabulous option, and it tends to be more common during pregnancy because it's easier to access. And there's you're less likely to have withdrawal symptoms in the baby. A couple things on this. So first, both of these medications are considered safe during pregnancy and safe for the baby. Very safe. They do not cause major problems. When withdrawal symptoms happen, when the baby is born and has withdrawal symptoms, those can be really scary, right? They're not necessarily pleasant, right? But they're very, very easily managed. We've learned that the best management is actually contact with the mom, even more so than medical interventions, right? It's being held, skin-to-skin contact. And so I think that's really telling in and of itself to help the baby through those withdrawals. And it doesn't constitute a substance use disorder. The baby's not born with an addiction in that case. And I think that's a really clear, that's something that really it can be hard for people to understand, right? Because we tend to think about that physical withdrawal as such a telltale sign of an addiction, but it's just physical withdrawal. The baby has no connection in its mind to what that means. So these 2 medications are very well established, but here's the thing, whether you're a pregnant person, a mom, like a new parent, or someone who doesn't have kids, the reasons that these medications are so effective is they help reduce the cravings, right? They help reduce that like need to go out physiologically and emotionally and mentally. So they kind of help calm that urgency to look for substances. And then once that is calmed, then you can work on the other stuff, right? You can work on maybe addressing trauma, maybe building better life skills, maybe working a job, right? So what we see is when people are taking these medications, they are more likely to be able to engage with employment, right? Hold a job, find a job. They're better able to meet their obligations with their family and their loved ones. Um, they're way less likely to use illegal drugs, right? They're not doing that as much anymore. And they're much more likely to stay in recovery than people who are not taking these medications. And recently we found with in the fentanyl landscape, overdose risk, methadone, I think the most recent study was methadone, but it cuts your risk of overdose death by like 80% compared to non-medication treatment. And non-medication treatment right now in our current drug environment, so that would be like abstinence-based treatment, something like Narcotics Anonymous by itself, or just therapy or whatever, it actually increases people's risk of overdose right now. Because if they do slip, if they do return to use at all, the supply is so potent, they're more likely than ever to overdose and die. And so these medications protect against all of these things. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
Yep. I think your last point is a really important one for people to hear too, because for a lot of, I think, family members and loved ones, they think if I can just get my loved one into treatment, I just need to get them into treatment. I just need to get them abstinent. I just need to get them to stop using. And whether I can coerce them into it or force them into it or whatever it is, I just need them into treatment. And that actually can increase their risk of death, because if a person is abstinent, their tolerance goes way down. If they are exposed then to substances again by recurrence of use, they don't have any way of kind of knowing how high that tolerance is. And like you said, the supply that people are getting is so potent and so unable to be adequately dosed because it's of unknown potency and purity if you buy it on the street, that it can be more dangerous for people to go to treatment and be abstinent than it is for them just to continue using like they were before. So it's part of the reason why, even though there is this part of me that's very, my heart goes out and I could totally see where people are like, I just want to force them to stop. And that I have a lot of empathy for that. And yet that forcing someone to stop can actually put them at greater risk of death, which is not what any of us want, no matter how frustrated we are with our loved ones' substance use. So as we wrap up, two things I wanted you to speak to. One, I know that you don't describe yourself as a person in recovery, and we've had other people talk about that on the podcast. I'd love to hear your thoughts on why that is, and just anything else that you want to share with us, anything as we just wrap up our conversation that you want people to know and what you hope they do with what they have heard today.
Yeah. No, the question about identifying with the term recovery is one, like, I put a lot of thought into this. I think it's partly that it's just super personal. The idea of recovery isn't something I ever really internalized. I didn't, because as I sort of alluded to, I kind of aged out. I graduated from university and moved across the country to a whole new social network where, like, out west where I was in high school and college, methamphetamine was really easy to get. I moved back east and meth was really hard to get in New York. Like, it just wasn't a thing in the early 2000s there, certainly not in the circles I was in. So I very much more aged out. And I think because of that, it never felt like, I just never became part of a recovery community. I also think there's part of me that thinks it's really important to not, as chaotic and sometimes problematic as my drug use was, there also were like rational choices where it served me. And like, to me, owning that and seeing that is part of how I've grown as a person. And like moving, kind of acknowledged that, yeah, it wasn't ideal. It probably wasn't the healthiest way to deal with things, but it also served me in those moments. And I was able to take lessons away from that I think have helped make me who I am today.
Hmm. So would you say it's kind of like instead of just saying that whole season of my life was bad and I was making bad choices, it is a more nuanced way of seeing that season as there were some unhealthy things. There were also ways that, and I think anybody who's using substances, there are ways in which it is serving them. That's why they're doing it. It's doing something for some period of time to make life better in some way, at least in their experience. And do you think I'm thinking about that the way that you're thinking about that? Is that kind of
Yeah, I think
what you're
that's
trying to kind of
exactly.
not just throw everything out and say, well, that was bad. That was the before times. But
Yep.
say, yeah, there were reasons I was doing that, and it was doing something for me that
Yep.
is
That's
part of.
exactly it. I think that's exactly it. You summed it up beautifully. Much better, I think, than I was doing it. So I appreciate that. And I think it's a really, like, it is personal. Like, most of my participants called themselves addicts, right? Like, that was language that they used. Um, but often it was language that they used because they had been in and out of treatment. And I think it's a very, I think the way we, all of us, whether we're talking about our substance use or eating habits or our health or whatever it is, right? We have really different relationships to how we choose to identify to those things. And that can affect our, I think, ability to cope with it. And I think for me, being able to see the good in those years and like the lessons that I learned and the purpose that the drug use did serve to me has given me insight into who I was and what I needed, and maybe what are healthier ways to cope with some of those same challenges when they come up later in my life.
Yeah. What do you hope people take away from today? What do you hope they do with it?
I mean, I think at the core of what I always hope people take away from talks about drug use is that people who are using substances are people just like them and dealing with the same complicated realities that shape all of their behaviors. It may not look the same, the behavior may not be the same, but the messiness of it, that's the same. Um, and that when we come out the door just like really focused on punishment as our number one orientation, we oftentimes end up doing more harm than good, even when that's not our intention at all, even when what we want is the best for these moms, for their kids, right? Oftentimes that just comes with a lot of unintended consequences.
Yeah. Love that. We love some nuance. We love looking behind the thing that we immediately see and seeing what's behind that. Let's dig a little deeper. Stacey, thank you so much for joining us and just sharing your own life experience and your research, and also just all the hats, the different hats that you've worn related to this. But I particularly love the work that you're doing now related to pregnancy and new moms and things like that. It's very near and dear to my heart. And you're doing a lot of that work and research and a lot of getting that out into the world at R Street. And I appreciate that. So thank you for not just your time today, but your broader work in this space.
Thank you. Thank you for the work that you've been doing and for the chance to come on here and have this conversation today.
Absolutely. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast yet, go ahead and do that now. You can leave a review. You're listening to this. It is in December, which means we're in giving time. And we have had a giving match at End It For Good. We had another foundation that offered to match giving up to $17,500. We're about halfway there. And so if you would like to support the work of End It For Good, whether it's the podcast or all the other things that we do, you're on our newsletter list, you follow us on social media, whatever it is, we would be so honored and love to have you join us as a financial partner. You can do that at enditforgood.com, or you can find us on PayPal or Venmo at End It For Good. We're everywhere. We will take any and all of your gifts. So thanks so much, everyone, and we'll see you next time for our 100th episode, and we'll be back to share some of the fun things that have been happening this year as we have closed in on this milestone. We'll see you next time on the End It For Good podcast. So how do we shift our drug policies from a criminal justice approach to a public health approach? By inviting one person at a time to change their mind. Changed minds are the catalyst to changed laws. But many people are only willing to have this conversation when they're invited to by someone that they trust. That's you. Invite your friends, coworkers, other people in your circle of influence to consider a better way. At End It For Good, our hope is that people who hear will become people who tell. Start a conversation and join the movement to end it for good.